Well, after that excellent international relations primer, I'm turning it back to domestic issues. And I want to talk about the way that the MAHA report, published last month by the Trump administration, is moving folks both inside Western medicine and outside of it, sort of towards a consensus in the middle. Now, that report, of course, riddled with errors, according to Stanford professor Dua Hassan, a pediatrician and, again, professor on staff at Stanford Medical, kind of a big deal. She was happy to see how the report raised questions about the over-dogmatization of the medical industry and the power imbalance between big pharma and patients. That being said, Jordan Crofton, a functional medicine doctor in New York City, talked about how, while these are good points, there still is a lack of strategy. But ultimately, everyone agrees if Robert F. Kennedy Jr. wasn't associated with this movement, and this was purely something the Trump administration was pushing and doing, I think it would move folks in traditional medicine towards a place where we can actually talk about these issues which are impacting people. Because to be fair, you need both sides of the coin here. You need folks vested in the current industry who want to reform it to, improve patient outcomes, and people who are raising questions on the outside. If there's no consensus, this doesn't actually, present a solution to Americans. And ultimately, that's what this is about, not pumping up RFK's friends in the wellness industry.
And look, none of this would happen without the disaster that was the public health apparatus's response to COVID.
Without a doubt, yeah.
This was, we knew early on that COVID hit people who were older and sicker harder. And as a response, we shut down gyms and beaches and parks. So there was, and of course the schools versus the protests where your 2-year-old couldn't go to preschool for a year and then with a mask, while the public health officials said racial equity is important in public health, and that means you should protest for George Floyd. That being said, of all that valid criticism, it is completely undermined by the fact that you have, in my opinion, a hack running HHS. When you talk about the idea of the grift, is big pharma just in it for the money? Are they just lining their pockets? Global pharmaceutical industry last year was worth $1.65 trillion. The global wellness industry was worth almost $7 trillion.
Oh, yeah.
So who's making more money there? And the original FDA was created because at the end of the 1800s, you had an explosion of a cottage industry of people at home promising you supplements or oils to cure ailments, give you more virility, give you more vitality. Sounds very similar to a lot of what you hear now on half the podcast.
Without a doubt.
And mind you, a lot of them are safer because the FDA exists, and the FDA, at minimum, even if a supplement can't solve an issue, they do have to adhere to standards to make sure they first do no harm, right? But the American people do not buy the outright vilification of crucial medication. Case in point with vaccines. So NBC just conducted a widespread poll. Only 7% of Americans strongly oppose using vaccines to prevent disease. 80% support it in some way. And only 3% blame vaccines for the chronic disease epidemic. There's so much space to correct the wrongs and the overreach of the Anthony Fauci's and all of that, and focusing on saying something like depression, the first line approach should be talk therapy, and it should be exercise, without vilifying SSRIs that have been incredibly helpful, without vilifying, the Ozempic as a last line of combating obesity, if diet and exercise hasn't worked.
I mean, the problem is ultimately the politicization of medicine, right? And the phrase trust the science should not be controversial, but you're now hearing folks on both sides of this debate using it to try and back up their entrenched position. Yes, we should be trusting the science when it comes to the decades of research we have, discrediting the link between vaccines of any kind and autism, right?
Yes.
But at the same time, we should look at research that suggests perhaps our approach to mental health has been lacking, especially in young men. Perhaps, we need to get rid of processed foods in the way that we are serving, especially under-resourced and underserved children, right?
Shout out Michelle Obama, who was talking about this.
It's a two-way street, right?
15 years ago.
And ultimately, the problem with RFK while there are many, is that he doesn't approach medicine as a science. He
No.
approaches it as a lawyer. He has these conclusions in his head, and then because he is smart and because he is willing to go through and read research, he can pull out anecdotes and interpret them in a way to back up that conclusion. And that is not the scientific method. That is not looking at this system empirically and trying to reform it. So, again, take the politics out of the medicine, and eventually we can maybe have some positive outcomes. But I am at least heartened that while this debate about MAHA, is it a grift, is it not, it's hard to say. People are at least looking at this issue and paying attention to it now in a way that they weren't before COVID.